my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am back with more of Pippi Longstocking, and we are on Chapter 9 today. Pippi has coffee with the ladies. Tommy and Annika's mother had invited several of the ladies over for coffee, and since she had done so much baking, she said that Tommy and Annika could invite Pippi at the same time. That way her own children would be much less trouble, or so she believed. Tommy and Annika were thrilled when they heard this. They immediately ran over to Pippi's house to invite her. Pippi was in her garden, using an old, rusty watering can to water whatever poor flowers were still left. Since rain was pouring down from the sky that day, Tommy told Pippi that it didn't really seem necessary. "Well, that's easy for you to say," said Pippi sternly, "but I lay awake all night, looking forward to getting up and watering my flowers, so I'm not going to let a little rain stop me, let me tell you." Then Annika told her the wonderful news. "Coffee with the ladies? Me?" cried Pippi, and she got so nervous that she started to water Tommy instead of the rose bush that she intended. "Oh, I don't know. It makes me nervous. What if I can't behave properly?" "I'm sure you can," said Annika. "Don't be so sure about that," said Pippi. "I'll do my best, believe me, but I've noticed many times that people don't think that I can behave properly, even though I try my very best. Out at sea, we were never so fussy about such things, but I promise to try really hard today so that you won't have to be ashamed of me." "Good," said Tommy, and then he and Annika raced back home through the rain. "This afternoon at 3 o'clock, don't forget," called Annika, peeking out from underneath her umbrella. That afternoon, at 3 o'clock, a very elegant young lady went up to the stairs to the Settergreen home. It was Pippi Longstocking. For a change, she was not wearing her red hair in braids. It hung down to her shoulders like a lion's mane. She had used a red crayon to color her lips bright red, and she had made her eyebrows so dark that she looked slightly sinister. She had also used the red crayon to color her fingernails, and on her shoes she wore big green bows. "I know I'm going to be the most elegant person at the party," she muttered happily to herself as she rang the doorbell. In the Settergreen's living room sat 3 refined ladies, along with Tommy and Annika and their mother. A marvelous spread of food had been set on the table, and a fire was burning in the fireplace. The ladies were quietly chatting with each other as Tommy and Annika sat on the sofa and looked through a photo album. Everything was so peaceful. But suddenly, the peace was shattered. "Company, attention!" A piercing shout came from the hall, and the next second Pippi Longstocking was standing in the doorway. She had shouted so loudly and so unexpectedly that the ladies had actually jumped. "Company, forward march!" Pippi shouted next, and then she marched briskly over to Mrs. Settergren. "Company, halt!" She stopped. "Present arms 1 and 2, she yelled, and she used both hands to grab one of Mrs. Settergren's, which she shook quite heartily. "Knees bend," she shouted, and she curtsied beautifully. Then she smiled at Mrs. Settergren and said in her usual voice, "I'm actually quite shy, so if I didn't issue commands to myself, I'd just stand in the hall, quite stubborn, and not dare to come in." After that, she rushed over to the other ladies and kissed each of them on the cheek. "Charmed, charmed, I'm sure," she said, because she had once heard a distinguished gentleman say this to a lady, and then she sat down on the best chair in the room. Mrs. Settergren had planned for the children to stay upstairs in Tommy and Annika's room, but Pippi calmly sat where she was, slapping her knees and casting glances at the food on the table. "That looks delicious. When do we start?" At that instant, Ella, the family's maid, came in with the coffee pot. Mrs. Settergren said, "Coffee is served." "Me first," shouted Pippi, and with 2 bounds she was over at the table. She piled on a plate as many little cakes as it would hold, tossed 5 lumps of sugar into a coffee cup, emptied half the cream jug into her cup, and then went back to her chair with her plunder before the ladies had even reached the table. Pippi stretched out her legs and balanced the plate of cakes between the tips of her toes. Then she swiftly started dipping her cakes in coffee. She stuffed so many of them in her mouth at once that she couldn't have uttered a word, no matter how hard she tried. In a blink of an eye, she finished off all the cakes on her plate. She got up, slapped the plate like a tambourine, and went back to the table to see if there were any more cakes left. The ladies gave her a disapproving look, but she didn't take any notice. Cheerfully chattering, she walked around the table, snatching a cake here and a cake there. "It was awfully nice of you to invite me," she said. "I've never been invited to coffee before." There was a big cream cake on the table. In the middle of it was a piece of red candy as a decoration. Pippi stood with her hands behind her back and looked at it. All of a sudden, she leaned forward and snatched up the candy in her teeth. But she had bent down a little too quickly, and then she straightened up. Her whole face was covered with cream. "Ha, ha, ha," laughed Pippi. "Now we can play blind man's bluff, because we already have a blindfold, and it's absolutely free. I can't see a thing." Then she stuck out her tongue and licked off all of the cream. "Well, that was quite an accident," she said, "but now the cake is just going to go to waste, so I might as well eat the whole thing." And she did. She launched into it with the cake server, and in a matter of minutes the whole cake was gone. Pippi patted her stomach contentedly. Mrs. Settigren had gone to the kitchen for a moment, so she knew nothing about the accident with the cake, but the other ladies were giving Pippi stern looks. They probably would have liked to have some of that cake themselves. Pippi noticed that they didn't look pleased, and she decided to cheer them up. "Let's not be sad about such a small and unfortunate incident," she consoled them. "The main thing is that we all have our health, and besides, you're supposed to have fun when you're invited to a coffee." She picked up the sugar bowl and scattered the lumps of sugar all over the floor. "Oh, what's this?" she cried in a shrill voice. "How could I ever make such a mistake? I thought it was granulated sugar, the kind that you're supposed to sprinkle. But now the damage is done. Luckily, there's only one thing to do if you happen to sprinkle sugar lumps by mistake. You have to do the opposite and try to make the granulated sugar into lumps." With these words, she picked up a container of granulated sugar from the table, and she sprinkled sugar on her tongue, trying hard to shape it into lumps. "Well, there you see. If it doesn't work, nothing will." Then she took the container of granulated sugar and sprinkled a large amount on the floor. "Please note, this is granulated sugar," she said, "so I'm perfectly entitled to do this, because I'd like to know what good it is to have granulated sugar if you can't use it for sprinkling. Have you ever noticed how much fun it is to walk on sugar that has been spilled on the floor?" she asked the ladies. "It's even more fun if you're barefoot," she went on, tearing off her shoes and stockings. "You really should try it yourselves. Nothing feels better. You can take my word for it." Now Mrs. Settigren came back in from the kitchen. When she saw all of the spilled sugar, she grabbed Pippi hard by the arm and led her over to Tommy and Annika, who were sitting on the sofa. Then she went to sit with the ladies, offering them more coffee. The fact that the cake was gone made her happy. She thought that her guest had liked it so much that they had eaten the whole thing. Pippi, Tommy, and Annika were talking quietly over on the sofa. The fire was crackling in the fireplace. The ladies were having another cup of coffee, and everything was once again nice and peaceful. Then, as sometimes happens when ladies gather for coffee, they started talking about their maids. They didn't seem to have found very good maids because they weren't the least bit happy with them. They agreed that they really shouldn't have maids at all. It would actually be much better to do everything themselves, because then at least they would know that it was done properly. Pippi sat on the sofa listening, and when the ladies had gone on like this for a while, she said, "My grandmother once had a maid whose name was Milan. She had chilblains on her feet, but otherwise there was nothing wrong with her. The only annoying thing was that as soon as any visitors turned up, she would dash over to them and bite them on the leg and bark. Oh, how she would bark. You could hear it all over the neighborhood. She was just being playful, but the visitors didn't like always understand that. The old wife of a vicar once came to visit Grandma after Malin had started working there. When Malin came running over and sank her teeth into the old woman's shin, the vicar's wife gave a howl. It scared Malin so badly that she sank her teeth in even deeper, and then she couldn't get loose. She was stuck like that on the leg of the vicar's wife until Friday. So Grandma had to peel the potatoes herself that day, but at least it was done properly. And she peeled them so well that when she finished, there were no potatoes left at all, only peels. After that Friday, the vicar's wife never came to see Grandma again. She really had no sense of humor, and Malin was just being playful and merry. But it can't be denied that once in a while she could also be rather moody. Once, when Grandma stuck a fork in Malin's ear, she spent the whole day sulking. Pippi gave everyone a friendly smile. "Well, that was Malin. Yes, it was," she said as she twiddled her thumbs. The ladies pretended that they had not heard a word. They kept on chatting. "If only my Rosa were at least clean and tidy," said Mrs. Berggren. "Then I might be able to keep her on. But she's like a pig." "Then you should have seen Malin," Pippi piped up. Grandma said that Malin was so grubby and grimy that it was a sight to behold. For a long time, Grandma thought she actually had dark skin, but it was all just dirt that could be washed right off. One time at a bazaar in the city hotel, she won first prize for the amount of black grime under her fingernails. "Oh yes, goodness gracious, how filthy that girl was," said Pippi merrily. Mrs. Settergren gave her a stern look. "Can you believe it?" said Mrs. Granberg. "The other evening, when my Britta was going out, she borrowed my blue silk dress without even asking. Isn't that the height of impudence?" "It certainly is," said Pippi. "I can hear that she and Malin are two of a kind. Grandma had a pink camisole, and she was terribly fond of it, but the worst thing was that Malin was fond of it too. And every morning Grandma and Malin would fight over who was going to wear that pink camisole. They finally agreed that they would take turns in order to be fair. But just think how mean Malin could be. Sometimes she would come running in when it wasn't even her turn and say, 'There won't be any mashed turnips if I don't get to wear that pink camisole today.' Well, what was Grandma to do? Mashed turnips were her very favorite thing. There was nothing to be done but give Malin the camisole, and once she got it, she would go out to the kitchen as nice as you please and start mashing turnips so hard that they spattered all over the walls." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Alexanderson said, "I'm not absolutely certain about this, but I have a strong suspicion that my Hulda is stealing. I do know that I've noticed things have been missing." "Malin," Pippi began, but then Mrs. Settergren said firmly, "Children, go up to your room right now." "Yes, but I was just going to tell you that Malin stole things too," said Pippi, "just like a magpie. Anything that wasn't nailed down. She used to get up in the middle of the night to steal a few things because she said that otherwise she couldn't sleep peacefully. Once she swiped Grandma's piano and stuffed it in the top drawer of her own dresser. Grandma said that she had very nimble fingers." Now Tommy and Annika took Pippi by the arms and started pulling her up the stairs. The ladies were drinking their third cup of coffee, and Mrs. Settergren said, "It's not that I really want to complain about my Ella, but she certainly does break a lot of china." A red head came into view from the banister. "Speaking of Malin," Pippi said, "maybe you were wondering whether she used to break any china. Well, you could certainly say that again. She set aside a specific day of the week for breaking china. Grandma told me that was on Tuesdays. By 5 in the morning on Tuesday, you could already hear that splendid girl smashing china out in the kitchen. She started with the coffee cups and glasses and the other smaller items, moved on to the soup plates and then the dinner plates, and ended with the meat platters and the soup tureens. Grandma said that she was happy to hear such a crashing in the kitchen all morning long, and if Malin had any time left over later in the afternoon, she would go into the sitting room with a little hammer and smash the antique East Indian plates that hung on the walls. Grandma always bought new china on Wednesdays," said Pippi, and she vanished up the stairs like a jack-in-the-box. By now, Mrs. Settergren's patience had come to an end. She ran up the stairs into the children's room and over to Pippi, who had just started to teach Tommy how to stand on his head. "You are not allowed to come here again," said Mrs. Settigren, "when you do not know how to behave, anything but badly." Pippi looked at her in surprise, and then slowly her eyes filled with tears. "It's just like I thought," she said. "I knew I wouldn't be able to behave myself. It's not even worth trying. I'm never going to learn how anyway. I should have stayed at sea." Then she curtsied to Mrs. Settigren and said goodbye to Tommy and Annika, and slowly went downstairs. But now it was also time for the ladies to go home. Pippi sat down on the boot rack in the hall and watched as they put on their coats and hats. "It's a shame that you don't like your maid," she said. "You should have someone like Malin. Grandma always said that she couldn't find a more wonderful maid. Just think, one Christmas when Malin was supposed to serve a roast pig, do you know what she did? She had read in a cookbook that a Christmas pig should be served with paper frills in their ears and an apple in their mouth. And poor Malin didn't realize that it was the pig that was supposed to have the apple. You should have seen her when she came in on Christmas Eve wearing a starched apron and with a big apple in her mouth. Grandma said to her, 'What a fool you are, Malin.' And of course Malin couldn't utter a word in her own defense. All she could do was wriggle her ears so that the paper frills rustled. She did try to say something, but it just came out blub, blub, blub. And she couldn't even bite anyone on the leg the way she usually did, even though there were so many visitors present that day. No, it wasn't a very pleasant Christmas Eve for poor Malin," said Pippi sadly. The ladies now had their coats on, and they were saying a last goodbye to Mrs. Settigren. Pippi ran over to her and whispered, "I'm sorry that I couldn't behave myself. Goodbye." Then she slapped her big hat on her head and followed the ladies out the door. But outside the gate, they went their separate ways. Pippi headed for Villa Villacula, and the ladies headed in the opposite direction. After they had walked a short distance, they heard someone huffing and puffing behind them. It was Pippi who had dashed after them. Believe me, Grandma was sad when she lost Malin. Just think, one Tuesday morning when Malin hadn't even managed to smash more than a dozen teacups, she just took off and ran away to sea. So Grandma had to break all the china herself that day, and she wasn't used to it, the poor thing. So she got blisters all over her hands, and she never saw Malin again. And Grandma said that it was a shame because she was such a marvelous maid. Then Pippi left, and the ladies hurried on their way. But after they had gone a couple 100 feet, they heard Pippi shouting in the distance at the top of her lungs, "And she never swept under the beds, that Malin." That is the end of chapter 9 and Pippi's tea party. So let's go back and look at all of the pictures. That was quite an event, wasn't it? Okay, so let's look. Remember that at the beginning, Pippi was watering her flowers. So there's a picture of her watering can spout. And then Pippi is all dressed up with a hat on and everything to go up the stairs to the tea party. And then here's all of the little cakes. And Pippi ate so many of the little cakes that everybody else didn't get very many because she ate so many. That's rude, isn't it? When you're at a party, you should not eat all the food. And then here's a picture of her sitting right between two ladies, and of course, she's talking about Malin, her grandmother's old maid. And she's eating all the cakes. Let's see if I can find some more pictures. Here's a picture of Pippi as she was leaving, and she was shouting to the ladies and saying, "And Malin never swept under the beds." And that is the end of chapter 9. Next time we'll read chapter 10, Pippi Comes to the Rescue. And this is Grandma Carla, and I love you.